What is a Mini LED TV? Is it better than other TVs? Well, you have the Samsung QM8, that's around $2,000. TCL's flagship QM8, that's around $1,200. And then you have the entry-level Hisense U6K at $600. They're all Mini LED TVs. But then you have the Sony X90L. That's more expensive than TCL's flagship Mini LED. So, does it make a difference that one TV's Mini LED and the other one isn't? Today, we're going to get into the truth about Mini LED TVs. It will surprise you. But in the meantime, I'm feeling kind of hungry. It's time to eat, but you're in the middle of watching me on your favorite TV. In other words, too busy to cook? So how about only 2 minutes for meal prep? Introducing today's sponsor, Factor. Choose from over 34 delicious dietitian-approved meals that are fresh, never frozen. Poke some holes, heat in the microwave for 2 minutes each, and yum. Most importantly for me, Factor has meals that meet my specific nutritional needs. How specific? Well, maybe you're into carb counting, so there is the keto menu for you. But a gym rat like me needs his protein. Let's try out my favorite Protein Plus meals. Herb-crusted chicken with mashed cauliflower and green beans, creamy tomato pork tenderloin with broccoli and mushroom. So head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code STOPTHEFOMO50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. Again, that's factor75.com. Use my code STOPTHEFOMO50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. What is a Mini LED TV? It is definitely not what you think in the context of what you're hearing from reviewers and retailers and the TV makers themselves. A Mini LED TV is essentially an LCD TV with a Mini LED backlight, but because Mini LED sounds so fancy, they call it a Mini LED TV. A Mini LED TV, a true one, is actually more like a micro LED TV. So we know what a micro LED TV is, right? Each self-emissive or each RGB pixel is a self-emissive micro LED. Super expensive. Micro LED TVs, 80 inches, over 80 inches, we're talking $100,000 or more. And a Mini LED is essentially a micro LED TV with slightly larger pixels, right? Micro is smaller than mini. And while there are Mini LED TVs out there, true Mini LED TVs, for example, LG has their cinema display. That's a Mini LED TV and it's over $80,000. But because LG does not want to add to the confusion, they call their true Mini LED TV cinema display direct view LED, right? So direct view, I mean, they're trying to separate it from what we now understand as a Mini LED TV. So when you hear Mini LED TV today, what we're talking about is an LCD TV with a Mini LED as part of the local dimming zone backlight system. Once we've cleared that up, right? LCD TVs and Mini LED TVs, same thing. The question then is, well, what does this Mini LED technology bring to the table? How does Mini LED, that Mini LED technology, make the LCD TV better? And to understand that, let's get into the two weaknesses of LCD TVs. Worse contrast than OLED. So we're going to compare everything to OLED because OLED is the holy grail image quality of all the TVs today, right? TVs today, you're either OLED or you're not OLED. If you're OLED, you benefit from infinite contrast and you have great dynamic range with no blooming. And LCD TVs have those two weaknesses, worse contrast and blooming and halo. So beginning with worse contrast, basically things look a little washed out, right? With better contrast, it looks real. It looks more dynamic. It's the best way to describe it. I mean, here's an image of what a better contrast looks like versus an LCD TV with no dimming zones at all. So dimming zones is how you solve the contrast problem. So you have LCD TVs with full array local dimming or dimming zones, right? And these things help LCD TVs to improve its contrast. More importantly, it helps eliminate blooming. So here's an example of what an image should look like on an OLED, no blooming, and with an LCD TV and you have local dimming zones, you still have some blooming. And without any local dimming zones, then everything looks washed out, right? Okay, so local dimming zones help improve contrast and eliminate blooming, but it's not completely eliminated. There's still some there. So then the answer is you increase the number of dimming zones. And as you increase dimming zones, you reach a point where, what more can I do? You add a mini LED layer. So you have local dimming zones, right? So this image kind of shows you what local dimming zones does. Well, mini LEDs are right there working with those local dimming zones to further improve the fine control of those dimming zones between the dimming zones and the mini LED. Together, they help control blooming, increase contrast, making the LCD TV get closer to OLED performance. This is in theory at least, and this is where we get to the crux of the matter. More local dimming zones, you add mini LED, and together, right? Mini LEDs do not sit in a vacuum. There's no such thing as an LCD TV without local dimming zones and only a mini LED layer. You have a local dimming zone and then zones, right? You have a full array local dimming system, and then you add mini LEDs to make it better. Then how do we explain the Sony X90L, which has dimming zones, local dimming zones, but no mini LED, and then you have the QM8 with 1,000 local dimming zones and a mini LED? How do those two TVs perform? What are these differences? And if mini LED makes the TV better, then why is the Sony X90L so expensive if it doesn't have any mini LEDs, right? So ultimately, this begs the question, does mini LED, that layer, that technology, make a big difference? So we answer that question. We compare the Sony X90L to the TCL QM8. So here are two extremes. The Sony X90L has less than 100 dimming zones at the 65-inch size, and the TCL QM8 has over 1,000 dimming zones at a 65-inch size, plus it has mini LED technology. So you would think it would be no comparison, right? And the best way to look at these differences is in real content. We're going to use the Spears & Munsell benchmark disc, as well as some clips from some popular movies to demonstrate whether does mini LEDs make a difference at all? Beginning with the Spears & Munsell benchmark disc, we see that the Sony jumps to brightness a bit quicker than the QM8, but I think this is more a function of the processor than the mini LEDs. Both TVs are rendering details in the clouds quite well, but tone mapping the horse in the snow scene at 2000 nits is a struggle for the QM8 compared to the X90L. So we turn on dynamic tone mapping, which brings back some of that contrast and shadow detail. Nevertheless, I don't suggest it in most scenes. In the next scene, I'm going to turn up the exposure a little so you can see a bit more of that shadow detail. And so far, the Sony X90L is doing quite well against the TCL QM8, despite lacking both dimming zones and mini LEDs. This sunrise scene is particularly interesting to me because the brightest part of the scene, that sun, is no more than 1,000 nits, and yet the Sony tone maps it better with less dimming zones and no mini LED. This tells me that the TCL has wasted its dimming zones and mini LED hardware, while the Sony is doing more with less thanks to better software. But of course, this next scene is designed for extra dimming zones and mini LED. Increase the exposure to help you see the differences. The QM8 maintains near perfect contrast and deep blacks around the brightest part of the scene, while the Sony X90L is showing classic signs of blooming. Scenes like this is why people want mini LEDs with thousands of dimming zones. Now, to be fair, when I take the exposure down to what I think is what we normally see, the blooming is not as obvious as you may think. And lastly, the Ferris wheel. The arms of the Ferris wheel are a bit brighter on the QM8. These specular highlights are definitely helped by the large number of zones and mini LEDs. And turning up the exposure a bit, we see that the X90L black levels between the spokes of the Ferris wheel aren't as deep as the QM8. And also the contrast of the areas around the boardwalk is a touch behind the QM8. But remember, I had to increase the exposure to make these differences more noticeable. In real life, they look a lot closer, with the most noticeable difference being the slightly brighter Ferris wheel spokes. Now on to HDR movies, beginning with The Crimes of Grindelwald. In this super bright scene, both TVs match in brightness, and the contrast within the brightest scenes are indistinguishable. This is an impressive accomplishment by the X90L. Next up, The Greatest Showman, and my favorite scene to demonstrate why we need more dimming zones. To get the specular highlights of that hat to really shine, you need more dimming zones, like what the QM8 is doing. But shockingly, the X90L gives me the same bright highlights with less zones. I'm increasing the exposure so you can see that the shadow detail is also preserved without raising near black levels. So the Sony X90L in this movie says no mini LEDs needed. How about bright HDR from Mad Max Fury Road, like the fire guitar scene. And we see that the black levels around the speakers are very similar, if not the same. In the super bright scene, top left corner, look at how the X90L matches the brightness of the QM8 while preserving all that shadow detail. Again, the X90L says, ha, I don't need mini LEDs. And everyone's favorite scene from Pan, look into the sun, the Sony X90L just as bright as the QM8, but more gradient detail. You see the wisp of clouds around the sun a bit better, and this is better tone mapping. Software, once again, beats brute force mini LEDs. Last HDR movie is Batman vs. Superman. In the super bright flashy scene, look at the shadow detail and contrast. Indistinguishable. Here, because this scene is so bright, you'll notice some blooming on the X90L in the vertical black bars. And again, this is that risk when you don't have enough dimming zones. But in return, you get a bit more shadow detail, although some may argue they prefer the increased contrast on the QM8. So is this better contrast or black crushing? You tell me. In this next scene, the QM8 has a touch slightly deeper blacks, but hardly noticeable. And in the middle of these next two bright scenes, look at how well the X90L preserves the contrast and detail against the QM8. I'm just floored at what the Sony X90L can do with less dimming zones and no mini LEDs. So those are movies, but then there's also one more thing to consider. Having lots of local dimming zones and having a mini LED to aggressively get those deep blacks, right? That high contrast, well, there is a weakness. There is a price to be paid, and that is the infamous Starfield. So the Sony X90L with only 80 dimming zones, it says to itself, you know what? I don't need perfect blacks. I just need good enough blacks. I'm going to focus on presenting all the stars. So in this comparison, you're going to have the Sony X90L with, again, only 80 dimming zones, or less than 100 for sure, in the 65-inch size against the TCL QM8. And we're going to have the G3 as a reference. You guys can see on the QM8, the blacks are deeper, almost OLED-like. However, you're losing some stars, whereas the Sony X90L, slightly lifted blacks, meaning the blacks aren't as black as the QM8, but all the stars are there. And of course, the G3 has both deep blacks and bright stars, and all the stars are there. Sony has said, wait, if I'm going to add all these dimming zones, and I'm going to add a mini LED, but I'm going to lose a few stars, what does it matter? I'll just stick with only 80 zones and make do and make it look as good as I can. Ultimately, it actually works, because I know many of you bought the QM8 and watched Star Wars or some of the later Star Wars movies, and you noticed, wait, I've lost some stars. This is unacceptable. And my suggestion was, well, if you're okay with slightly lifted black bars, as you saw in some of the previous movie scenes, get the Sony X90L, right? I mean, it's slightly lifted black bars, or on the side or on the top, depending which movie you're watching, but everything is there. And the brightness is no different. So here's the part that kind of surprised me. The Sony X90L brightness matched the QM8 in sports content, right? Well, the Sony looked identical to the QM8 in terms of contrast, in my opinion. The Sony colors obviously has its own special twist and might be more appealing to many of you. It did make a difference that the QM8 had mini LED and the Sony did not. As far as full screen content, the Sony, to me, looked as good, if not better, in many scenes. And the if not better part was the color, right? Sony color being what it is, always top notch. But if we're just looking at contrast and luminance levels and all of that, where the mini LED and local dimming is supposed to make a big difference, the Sony wasn't that behind, if at all. If anything, it may be ahead in some scenes. So, but at worst, it was a match, in my opinion. That leads me to one conclusion. With lots of dimming zones, adding mini LEDs, it kind of elevates that approach. However, you are always going to have this weakness, this compromise of, if you go after the deepest blacks, you're going to lose some detail in specular highlights that are a little bit too dim. The super bright specular highlights will always be there. But if it's a little bit too dim, you're aggressively hitting that contrast, hitting that deep black, you're going to make it disappear. And if you have less than 300 dimming zones, there is no point to having Mini LED. So even TCL, the inventor of Mini LED TVs, with this year's flagship QM8 with over 1,000 dimming zones, they have these 3 objectives, but only 2 of them really work. First is the deepest black you can get, right? Contrast, hopefully it matches OLED one day. All the stars, they need to be there, and each star is the specular highlight it should be, right? Bright stars. OLED does all 3. So where does the QM8 fall short? We saw that it has a deep black, but not all the stars are there. And the ones that are there are the brightest stars. But the dimmer stars, they're gone. Sony is willing to give up on the deepest blacks, right? The high contrast, they're willing to give that up. But now they have these 2. Can the Sharp XLED TV with 2,000 dimming zones and Mini LED backlight combined with 2,000 dimming zones, can Sharp have all 3? I will be reviewing that TV. Check it up here when the review is ready. In the meantime, check my other Mini LED TV reviews here and here. Until next time, stop the FOMO.